Hello, I'm Maryanne Loughry. I'm a research professor at Boston College, psychologist, Jesuit refugee service worker, and an occasional traveller with Jane McAdam. Jane and I have done some travel earlier to have a look at climate displacement, and today we're going to have a conversation about how we got into that work. To introduce you to Jane, Jane McAdam, AO, is Scientia Professor of Law and Director of the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Jane's been working on issues related to climate change, mobility and the law for well over a decade. In fact, Jane wrote the first book to examine how international law protects people displaced in the context of climate change and where gaps remain. Drawing on fieldwork undertaken in Kiribati, Tuvalu, Bangladesh and India, she analysed whether such displacement should be viewed as another facet of traditional international protection or as a new challenge requiring more creative legal and policy responses. Since then, Jane has been part of those key policy processes, including as an expert advisor to UNHCR, the Nansen Initiative on disaster-induced cross-border displacement, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and the Pacific Climate Change Migration and Human Security Program. She also spearheaded the International Law Association's Sydney Declaration of Principles on the protection of peoples displaced in the context of sea level rise, which has fed into the UN climate processes and is helping to shape the International Law Commission's work on this topic. So Jane, that's an awful lot to say, and I'm very happy to have introduced you. But what I'd really like to know, Jane, is how did you get into this work?
Thanks very much, Maryanne. Thanks for joining me for this discussion and, of course, for all the work that we've done together in the past. Well, it was quite accidental the way I fell into this work, as is sometimes the case. It was late 2006 and I received a call from media asking me if I'd speak on radio about environmental refugees. And my initial reaction was somewhat dismissive and, oh yeah, of course I can do that because there aren't, there's no such thing legally as an environmental refugee. And I thought I would just explain why. But I think it's something lodged in my brain, and just for the benefit of people, I should explain my thinking behind that. In law, a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group, and they're outside their country. And so, as a straight definition, environment doesn't appear in there, and I hadn't yet done the thinking to realise how the refugee definition might apply. So anyway, I did that interview. Something must have lodged in my brain because it was then coming back the following year, 2007, from a research trip in Myanmar where I'd hoped to look at the legal issues surrounding statelessness. And for various reasons, I could see that project wasn't going to be able to proceed in the way I'd hoped. I was in transit reading a newspaper article about climate change, was thinking about the project that wasn't working, put two and two together and thought, oh, I think I've heard things about, disappearing states. What would happen to people if they couldn't live in their homes any longer? And that's what really set me off on what's become a massive part of my career. How about you, Maryanne? What was it that prompted you to get involved?
I got interested in this because I had been working in Oxford, the Refugee Studies Centre, for 8 years, and I had the opportunity to come back to Australia. And I thought, I wonder what are the kind of forced migration points in our region, in our neighbourhood. And I was aware of what had happened in Timor-Leste and was still happening with displacement. I became aware of what was happening in West Papua and into Papua New Guinea. And at the same time, I started to become aware of statements that were coming out from the World Council of Churches, from the churches in Fiji, about climate displacement, mainly because of what was then called sea level rise. And I thought it would be interesting to find out what was going on. So through several opportunities, I got to visit some of my Pacific neighbours and came to understand that this was a very pressing issue for them. Jane, you and I, we had the chance to actually present a paper very early in 2007 at the Refugee Studies about this issue. Can you remember how well it was received and what the comments were?
Well, I think for me, thinking back to that period, we were still in that phase where, firstly, you begin by saying, well, I'm not an expert on climate change, and everyone would preface their remarks with that, but here's what I know. But at the same time, there was a lot of need to sort of say, well, I'm not a climate skeptic, or if climate change is real. We were still in that period where the science was often called into question. I mean, arguably we still are, but in a very different context. And in fact, I recall at a Christmas party telling somebody what I was working on, and he said, oh, that's interesting. The university lets you work on issues that aren't even proven to exist. And I later discovered he was a member of the National Party. But nonetheless, when we would present, we would need to kind of, we provide all these caveats. And I also remember somebody, in fact, a number of people saying to me, but what if climate change isn't real? Doesn't that upend the whole of your research? And I think that's where it became very useful to say, well, irrespective of what's driving all of this, we can plainly see there are disasters happening, and how are we going to address that? And that's enabled a lot of the work to be anchored, including through the Nansen Initiative on disaster-induced cross-border displacement, which of course brought in climate change, but focusing on disasters also meant that it could then focus on earthquakes and things that aren't necessarily affected by climate change. I think 2007 was a crucial moment because that was also when the fourth Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report had been handed down. And I think that's why we suddenly saw people looking at this in the social sciences. And I think too, at that early stage, we were really still trying to understand what differential impact climate change had as opposed to other drivers of movement. And people like Professor Stephen Castles were very clear from the start, saying this is all multi-causal. And I noticed our own paper recognised the multi-causality of movement, that climate change is a factor that amplifies existing vulnerabilities. But at the same time, I think in some contexts we didn't know. So the small island states, for example, I thought, well, there climate change would play, the role in forcing people to move. And yet when we went there, we realised it very quickly that, even in that context, climate change plays this amplifying or exacerbating effect. It's always other drivers of vulnerability or movement that are what often cumulatively make people think it's better to leave rather than stay.
What I remember, Jane, is also that we were warned not to work in this area. I remember when we met with some of the geographers and people who had worked in the Pacific in particular, they explained to us that atolls and small islands always change shape and have water inundation, so that if we dared to sort of say that climate change was one of the dominant factors, we would be putting our own scholarship at risk. And the other thing I remember is that when we did find any social science paper looking at climate change, we immediately exchanged them because there were so few people working in this space. Whereas now we'd be overwhelmed if we kept trying to exchange the material that's going on. So it was very early, and you're right, people were saying be cautious in this space because it was still to be explored. But I wonder, Jane, also, can you give us some sense of what we were saying in 2007 and what people were predicting around the numbers that were going to be displaced?
Yes, well, the numbers were kind of fixated upon. And in fact, because there wasn't a lot out there at that point, I remember being able to track down through, going right to the end of Google pages, where this figure kept coming up from. And a scholar called Norman Myers, I'm sure not realizing for a moment what this figure was going to take on a life of its own, but he had estimated that by 2050, 150 million people would be displaced by climate change. And he later revised that figure up to 250 million. That actually became that was mischaracterized by an organization called Christian Aid, which put the figure at 1 billion people by 2050. And you can imagine the the media interest in a figure like that. And the problem with all of this was that the figures were calculated on an extremely crude methodology. I mean, even today we know that the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre, which aggregates data, will say proxies are used. They're not, perfect, because we're looking at all sorts of things to try and determine how many people are moving where and why. But they recognise, they can methodologically explain it all, and the figures are certainly much more robust than they once were. What Myers did was to say, all right, these are the hotspot countries. This is the projected population in 2050. Bang, that's the 150 million or the 250 million people. And that was very problematic. The other thing that was problematic was this idea that this is climate change drives this number.
Yes.
And as I said before, it's multi-causal. So it was, and even today, it remains an issue to consistently be able to explain how these different factors intersect. And also the numbers of people on the move, the vast majority are moving within their own countries, not across borders, and that wasn't being factored in here at this point either. And as you mentioned, geographers, I mean, the geographers were hugely influential on my thinking, partly because they had done so much work in the geographical areas I was interested in, but also the dynamics of movement. So in some respects, my approach was necessarily interdisciplinary from the start, partly because the Refugee Studies Centre, where I'd also worked and studied to some degree, that's just what you do. It's multidisciplinary, but also because there weren't many lawyers working in the field. So I was necessarily looking at all the other literature to try and build up my understanding of what this was all about.
No, and thanks, Jane. And I remember also being impacted with the question around numbers, because I'd done some very early work in Vietnam where people would move seasonally. So they would move when there was flooding because of the Mekong, but then and put their children in a new school. And then when the flooding ceased, they'd go back to their original house. So the thought of, well, do they count or not count as a mover, or if they're a temporary mover? And the same thing when I eventually got to some of these small islands in the Pacific, where I found it was very circular as to people moving and being on the mainland for some time, then back in their own small island. So they didn't even know fully who was normally populating the small island. So I realized that just counting was going to be a sort of a tricky issue. But I think also, Jane, one of the bigger issues for us was what category could you give to these people? What was a good language? And you've already referred to environmental refugees, but what was your thinking in those days, and how are you still thinking about how to categorize these people who've been forced to move, possibly because of climate being one of the factors?
Well, I think that even now we see climate refugees being used just as the shorthand term very often, and I understand why that is, but it's still, from a legal perspective, inaccurate. And also, I mean, I guess what we've understood there is that, there are refugees fleeing because climate change is there in the mix, but the language of climate refugees is not a legal term. But as a descriptor, I understand why it is used. I think for me, what quite aside from the legal point, what really brought it home, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this too, was the rejection of that term by the people we met with initially in Kiribati and Tuvalu, but elsewhere as well. And I mean, you might, Maryanne, like to explain what the bugbear was with that terminology.
Well, I think for me, the biggest surprise was the people that we spoke to absolutely did not want the term refugee given to their situation. And when asking them a little bit more, what was the problem with the term, it was the portrayal of refugees as being sad people behind barbed wire was the first thing. And they didn't see themselves as wanting to have that caricature. And that I was saddened by that, because that being seen as how refugees are isn't exactly how I've always met refugees. But the second point was that they very clearly grasped that refugees were not always in favour of their country. And yet the people we were talking to were finding their country was trying to help them in their plight. And so they didn't want to be seen as oppositional to their country. So they, I thought, clearly said and explained to us that that was not a term that they were comfortable with. and that we then had to find a way of talking about them without kind of using a term that was offensive to them.
And yeah, I think the other thing that I am reminded of there too was the idea that refugees are victims and reliant on humanitarian assistance. And people were saying very clearly, we're not victims. We've got a lot to offer. And former President of Kiribati, Anote Tong, really pushed this idea of migration with dignity as a form of adaptation, saying, you know, we've got stuff to offer. We're not coming for handouts. We're coming to work, to contribute. So, I mean, I think you're right. Those, you know, for me, those twin things of what people felt, obviously, but the legal underpinning are reasons why I still don't like the term. But if I could just note, there's a scholar, Francois Gémen, who also, you know, took the view that we're putting forward here, but actually sometime later came back and said, you know, perhaps there's a reason that maybe we've depoliticized the notion of climate-related movement. If we call it something as bland as that, we've taken out the politics, which is that climate change, you know, the experience of those moving, often they are people in poorer countries and vulnerable situations, and we've somehow made it normal instead of recognizing that we are all responsible for this. So I thought that was an interesting perspective as well.
I think so. Yes.
Maryanne, I remember when we were there, in the Pacific, you know, one of the issues was that at that time already, foreigners flying in and asking questions were probably, you know, the assumption was we were doing research on climate change. So I just wondered, how did you try and get around that in the work that you were doing there?
No, thank you. It was what I was grateful for was partnership on the ground. I was able to work through a couple of groups, especially in Kiribati. I was able to link up with some of the faith-based groups that had been there forever, providing education and pastoral care. So they were able to introduce me to some of the, in particular, the younger people who were becoming very aware of what was happening to their country. So rather than coming in as the complete foreigner unknown to anybody, I was able to stay with people and just be introduced slowly to people who were of influence or people who were prepared to talk. So Kiribati was very, very helpful that way. I remember when we went to Tuvalu, it's very hard to kind of be unassuming in Tuvalu because of it being so small and everybody knowing that a foreigner had arrived. And if you remember, we actually were living almost on the airstrip. So you'd walk from the airstrip to the accommodation. So that was a little bit trickier. And I don't know if you remember, Jane, but I remember turning up in government offices and there'd be nobody there to meet us. So it was clear to me that we needed good relationships, good connections, good networks in order to really talk to people and find out what they were really thinking. You had some very good appointments in Kiribati with the government, and that was very, very helpful as well. But I was mindful that we were trying to sort of be not anthropologists, but to hear the story from the people's perspectives rather than us coming with preconceived notions and ideas. And I think that worked to a degree. I really enjoyed your reflection when you wrote about what we've heard from the people. I think that was something that was completely new. So I just think it was, the other thing that stands out for me is also our contributing to the problem by being in these places, because just even being on the islands, we were taking away from the electricity, from the resources, and I could see how you really needed to be there and to get the information, but not to keep taxing the people because they were tired of being interviewed, and we were sort of impacting on their life and on the carbon emissions simply by flying in and arriving. So that sensitivity became very pronounced to me.
Mm. That's absolutely right. And I think it's, you know, that was 2000 and when were we there? 2009, I think. So, you know, and I've been back since, and I think if we were finding that fatigue from research at that point, I can only imagine what it's like now. You also went to the Carteret Islands, which featured in a lot of media at that time about, as the first case of people being displaced by the impacts of climate change. Can you explain the context there and what you found?
Yes, actually, I was very lucky to be, when I was in Papua New Guinea for other work, I met the head of UNHCR at the time, who had an interest in climate change. And Bergie, her name was, Bergie invited me to go with her to Bougainville, which is a semi-autonomous part of Papua New Guinea, because we knew that people had attempted relocations in the past and were being supported by private endeavours from the Carterets to Bougainville. But there'd been a civil war there, and it also, the first relocations hadn't worked, but there were still attempts happening, as well as the government itself looking to see how they could relocate people. So we were talking to a lot of the people in Bougainville itself who had come from the Carteret Islands, but I didn't really have a full understanding of the Carterets itself and how that relocation was happening. As it happened, it was around COP13, and which was going to happen in Bali. And suddenly I became aware, as you do in small places, as you said, as a foreigner, that the Daily Mail from the UK were also in Bougainville and had hired a small boat. So I convinced them to take me in the small boat to the Carterets. And I think I had like hours to prepare, and people said, well, one of the things I need to take is food because there's no electricity and fuel on the Carterets. So I did. I jumped in this small boat and off we went. And I had permission to stay in the church when I got there, which hadn't had people in it for some time. But again, it was very obvious that I was taxing the environment, in the sense that even with the food I'd brought, people said, yes, they're happy to sell me fish and they'd be happy to cook. But had I bought the oil for the cooking? I thought, oh, I hadn't even thought about that. And also people having other things to do with their time. And here I am presuming that they'd want to sit down and talk with me as well, without any prior notice that I was coming or appointment. But in the Pacific, people are so gracious that I did have a great opportunity to talk to people. What we were doing is trying to also have an understanding that if there was relocation, who would want to relocate? And it was fascinating for me, because what became very apparent was the role of clans. There were clans, different clans on the Carterets, even though it was a small population. And there were also a different concept of family. So if there was going to be family relocation, they didn't necessarily want to stay to a nuclear family definition. This also, when I got back to Bougainville, seemed to be a surprise to the Bougainville government, because they were presuming on a nuclear family concept. And I was thinking, well, I don't think that's what the people themselves are thinking. So in the end, through UNHCR, we actually did a mapping of the people themselves and the clans and what it would look like should there be relocation. So it became quite an interesting project. I have to tell you, one of the exciting parts of returning, I was only a few days on the Carterets, was that we did have, and I don't remember the name of the person, and it wasn't one of the senior people, but there was a younger woman who came in the boat with us because she was also had been invited to Bali to talk about relocation. We did get lost returning. We ran out of fuel returning. We had high seas. So it was the adventure was much more of an adventure than I anticipated. And I still to this day, when I get into boats, think about it. So it was quite a learning in many, many ways. But I'm grateful for having been there. And I very much support the us needing to talk to the people themselves about their relocation, rather than just making lots of assumptions about who needs to move and how they'll move and where they'll move.
Maryanne, I think just what you said there about that long journey and dangerous journey that you went on, this is also something that for Pacific Islanders who are taking part in international talks, this is just part and parcel of what they need to do. And it's it's not easy. It's certainly not cheap. Airfares are extremely expensive, and I think, and the distance to get from the Pacific to, well, you know, if it's Geneva, that's going to take a long time. And I think all of that, all those things can be barriers to participation, of course.
I think, Jane, that again, from learning about this, it's one of the things I can see is representation of people impacted is so significant, but it's so effortful for them rather than for those of us who probably are more familiar with these sorts of movements. And the other thing is where they are in the schedule, where they are on the agenda, whether people bother to listen to them. As you and I know, we've heard about the plight of people in Alaska who've been trying to move for decades. Now we're aware of, again, decades, people in the Pacific. And now with deep experience of what works and what doesn't work in relocation, what works and doesn't work in trying to acquire new land or different land for people. And this is all done with governments that are not emitters and governments that don't have big budgets. So I think I'm immensely grateful for having had the insight, met some of the people, but seeing the obstacles that they have in trying to make a difference at the international policy level is phenomenal.
That's absolutely right.
Jane, we've also had other sorts of learnings. You've actually explored exactly that concept of either people acquiring different land or people actually no longer having land, but still wanting to be identified as a country. What did your fieldwork sort of teach you about these kind of concepts?
Well, perhaps quite strangely, given that we're talking about climate change, a whole tranche of my work has been historical. And it goes to that point you're making about learning and good practices and understanding what works and what doesn't. And, you know, when we started out, there was a lot of talk about, oh, well, you know, Tuvalu, only 10,000 people, just move them somewhere else, as though A, there was a country willing to do that, and B, that would be what people from Tuvalu would want. There was, you know, no consideration of attachment to land, place, self-determination, culture, any of that. And there were even some scholarly proposals which were, you know, very well intentioned in the sense that they would argue for a quota. The largest greenhouse gas emitting country should take X number of people based on their emissions. But again, had no factoring in of the humanity of people, the dignity of people, and the fact that that's not what people would want. So the other thing too was that around the time we began in this work, Tuvalu was at that point in when I say negotiations, approaching different governments, including Australia, and asking if there was land to which they could relocate should they need to. Now, Tuvalu, by the time we were there in 2009, had abandoned that, and they said, no, that's not what we're doing. But it has perennially popped up. But what I was looking at was in the 1940s, there were a handful of cross-border relocations. Now, today we're mainly talking, in fact, exclusively with what we've seen are internal relocations where people move, could be up the road, 2 kilometres away, or a greater distance. What I was aware of were these few cross-border relocations of communities. And they actually occurred in what is now present-day Kiribati and Tuvalu. They were from there, and the ones I looked at were both to Fiji. So I visited the communities in Fiji. The islands they had been had gone to had been bought by the islanders. The group from living on Rambi, which they were originally from Barnaba and Kiribati, the island had been bought on their behalf, and they felt absolutely duped into being moved there after the Second World War. They were told their island had been completely destroyed during the war. There had been some destruction, but by and large, the real reason was that the British, Australians, and New Zealanders wanted to mine that island for phosphate as much as they could. And that sense of injustice remains with the people on Barnaba. You talk to 16-year-olds who will tell you the story, who will you can see that sense of this is unfair. Why did this happen to us? And the three things to note, or two things to note, were firstly, there were immensely innovative and complicated legal and political structures set up in terms of people acquiring dual citizenship if they wished. Anyone on Rambi in Fiji now, they've got parliamentary representation back in Kiribati, even if you're not a citizen of that country, because you don't automatically get dual citizenship, but you can take it up. So there's this political structure that gives representation there within Fiji. They have their own local council and so on. And also the trust fund, there was a trust fund set up with the proceeds of the some proceeds of phosphate mining. So for a time, they had quite significant resources. But notwithstanding all of that, the sense is this was not right. And I think that to me shows just how important it is that communities are driving any suggestions of relocation, that they are there in the discussions, that the communities that they're moving to are also privy to, or not privy, part of those discussions. Even now there are clans from Fiji saying that's actually our island. So, this is going on decades into the future. So for me, that was very, very helpful to try and put forward, we'll look at what's happened in the past and look what could happen in the future if this isn't done well.
And you remind me, Jane, that one of the things we discovered is there's no such thing as vacant land.
Absolutely.
There's claims on every piece of land as wherever we were. Yep. I'm just aware, Jane, that one of the things that I think, and you mentioned a tiny bit earlier about the looking at the internal displacement, that nowadays we now also have the wildfires in the US. We have in Australia our own bushfires. I think there's been a sort of a sense of us needing to start to think about this is not just something that happens in the Pacific or in Alaska or in, along the Great Mekong or something, but it's happening everywhere. That the possibility of being displaced because of what's happening with our climate and with the factors associated with it is becoming now something that all states need to be aware of. I'm wondering if you've got any wrap-up comment.
Yeah, no, that's true, Maryanne. And I think, after the summer bushfires in 2019-20, I wrote a piece talking precisely about that Australians don't think of themselves as internally displaced or as having internally displaced people, but in fact, it's now been estimated some 65,000 people were displaced because of the bushfires, and many of them for a prolonged period of time. It wasn't just you're evacuated and you go home. And the costs of that are huge, social costs, personal costs, and financial costs for our economy. And I wonder, how this plays out then when you recognise this is happening here. We saw scenes in New York in the past. We've seen scenes everywhere pretty much. Do people reflect and say, wow, if that's happening here, how bad must it be in other places too, where you don't have the kind of social security safety nets and governments that can step in? Or do people look inwards and say, wow, it's happening here, so I'm going to focus on us? And I think what is a very humbling image that stays with me from the fires was pictures of Pacific Islanders walking around their villages with wheelbarrows, collecting aid for Australians affected by the fires. So I would hope that in a country like ours, we would have that same outward-looking capacity to recognise also that, just like the pandemic, we're all in this together, and we really all need to be trying to make a difference.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for your passion. And thank you for your networking with emerging scholars who are looking into this area and policymakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maryanne, for this discussion. It's been great.